and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion. I'm Ladi Akiridoluali. First, the headlines. Ukraine refuses to surrender Mariupol city, rejecting a demand from Russia to give up the city by 5 a.m. today. President Volodymyr Zielinski suggests Jerusalem for mediation talks with Russia. Plus, New Zealand to provide Ukraine with more money as well as non-lethal military assistance. Several hours have now passed since a deadline set by Russia for Ukraine to give up the besieged port city of Mariupol, where more than 300,000 people are believed to be trapped with dwindling supplies. The Russian military had given Ukraine until 5 Moscow time on Monday to announce the city's surrender, promising that in return it would safeguard 2 humanitarian corridors for civilians to leave. The country's deputy prime minister says Ukraine has rejected the ultimatum, adding that there can be no question of any surrender or laying down of arms. Speaking to the BBC, an advisor to the city's mayor had said Russia's promises could not be trusted and the defenders would fight to the last soldier. It's not clear now what could happen because Moscow did not specify what its troops encircling the city would do if the surrender ultimatum was rejected. In the meantime, the death toll in the overnight bombing of a shopping center in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv rose to 6, with rescuers combing the wreckage for other victims. The 10-story building was hit by a powerful blast that destroyed vehicles in its car park as well. And Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zielinski on a Sunday, that's yesterday, again called for direct talks with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, but stressed Russia's negotiation requirements related to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty are unacceptable, and that's according to a U.S. media outlet. In an interview on CNN, Mr. Zielinski had said he's ready for negotiations with Putin and believes that the Russia-Ukraine conflict will not end without negotiations. The Ukrainian president, however, stressed that some of Moscow's demands for ending the conflict, including the recognition of the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk and of Russia's sovereignty over Crimea, are unacceptable. In another related development, Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu has said that Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement on key issues which could lead to a ceasefire soon. Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are to continue with their online talks on Monday. According to a Ukrainian official, the talks are continuing every day at the level of expert groups. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president says Israel is undertaking many efforts to arrange top-level talks between his country and Russia and suggests they might take place in Jerusalem. The president says the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, is trying to find a way of holding the talks, adding that that's the right place to find peace if it's going to be possible. And New Zealand will be providing Ukraine with a further 5 million New Zealand dollars in funds and non-lethal military assistance, including some surplus equipment. That's made known by Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern, who said the money would be primarily directed to a NATO trust fund that provides fuel, rations, communication equipment and first aid kits to support Ukraine. This brings New Zealand's total assistance to Ukraine to 11 million New Zealand dollars. The New Zealand Defence Force will provide tactical equipment such as body armor, helmets and vests that are surplus to requirements. New Zealand has also imposed sanctions on Russia and arranged a special visa for Ukrainians with New Zealand connections as Ukraine battles Russian forces that invaded it on February the 24th.
And vests. We have pledged an additional $5 million to support Ukraine as they continue with the defence of their homeland. This will include a contribution to the NATO Trust Fund to provide immediate non-lethal military assistance, such as much-needed fuel, military rations, communications and military first aid kits. Today, the government has also decided to support the Ukrainian armed forces with tactical defence equipment, such as body armour, helmets and vests. we consider what is happening in Ukraine as a massive disruption to the international rules-based order, and because of that, it impacts all of us. And that's why we have taken these extraordinary measures.
100 evacuees from villages occupied by Russian soldiers arrived in the town of Brovary on the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital overnight. Men, women and children poured into Brovary in buses, escaping the devastating conflict in their hometowns. Many described the situation as a nightmare. And according to the UN Refugee Agency, 10 million people have been displaced by the fighting since Russia's invasion on February the 24th, including nearly 3.4 million who have fled the country as refugees. And talking about refugees and mass migration, we're being joined from London by immigration lawyer, Mr. Dayo Fadino. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the program.
Oh, good morning. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
When people are displaced in the way that people have been displaced in the Ukraine by conflict, what are their options when they have to leave?
Once again, good morning. The Russian-Ukraine conflict at this point is causing so much problems for neighboring European countries. As we speak, well over about 10 million people have been displaced and dislodged. We have a situation where we have, at this point in time, about 3 million refugees all over Europe, particularly the neighboring countries. Poland, you have Romania, you have Hungary, Belarus, Slovakia, and so many other countries actually now taking in these refugees. And what we need to be looking at this point is, many of these refugees looking up to international organizations and agencies to be able to actually take care of them. We have a situation where it seems this refugee crisis would continue, and we do not even know when or how this conflict would come to an end. And for these reasons, there should be so many international agencies, and we have so many of them, who should now be coming to the aid of so many of these refugees all over Europe. It's a very, very tough, hard situation for so many of them. We have children, we have children who have been bombed, women who have been killed, the whole country, Ukraine, been decimated and destroyed by the Russian forces. So indeed, many of these international organizations, we have, the Refugee Council, we have the UNICEF, and so many others should be coming to the aid of all these refugees who are now being displaced through no fault of theirs. There's also a situation which is quite ironic, where you have the Russian army, and Air Force bombing the Ukrainians, and these same Ukrainians are also quite discriminatory against African students who are in Ukraine, not allowing them to actually enter the same buses or the same trains. The whole thing is now becoming so not very helpful for the whole world at all, for all this to be happening at this point in time.
There are different categories of people who are migrating, of course, and as you've pointed out, and as we've reported, about 10 million people already in just about a month of the invasion have been displaced. Now, 10 million people on the move. Amongst them are citizens of Ukraine, foreign residents of Ukraine, and then students like the Nigerians you alluded to there, and then other professionals who may have been just caught up, trapped by the conflict. When they move to other countries, from what we have seen, some of the neighboring countries, particularly Poland, Hungary, and Romania, have issued special considerations to allow them come in, but those considerations have a timeline. Now, beyond that timeline, what happens to them if they don't leave becomes an actual issue. And that's why I said, you know, what options do they have under international law, under immigration law, to help themselves if nobody is actually coming to their aid? And then, of course, there's the issue of the International Office of Migration, which probably should be front and center of all of this, shouldn't it?
Indeed, indeed. You're quite correct in that respect. What many of these refugees should be doing, whether you whether you are actually Ukrainian or whether you are citizens of other countries, what they should be doing is indeed looking up to the international community, particularly the UN, because under the UN Convention for Refugees, there is very, very clear that where we have a very war-torn zone, where people are fleeing violence and killing, the UN Convention states very clearly that all neighboring countries where these refugees are running to, they should be actually taken care of by international agencies, looking for at least providing the necessary housing, the necessary feeding, medical care for so many of these refugees. So it's an international obligation on the part of the UN and so many other international organizations to be able to actually take care of all these refugees. And that's what should be happening right now. There are some people who are actually going to other countries. Take, for instance, the moment you are able to actually cross over to a place like Poland or Hungary, if you have family members in France, in Germany, or in the UK, there are things put in place right now where you could now apply or even being given that right straight away to move to France or to move to Germany. The UK is a little bit sluggish on this in the sense that they still believe that they should be applying for visas. They've also put a very particular scheme in place right now where they are appealing to UK citizens, if they could actually accommodate any of these refugees, they are prepared to at least give that incentive of about £350 per refugee. So these are the measures being put in place right now by most of the European countries surrounding Ukraine, and the countries that are not too far, that are a bit far away from Ukraine. All these measures have been put in place for them to actually be taken care of. It's an international obligation, and it's a human right of every single person who has been displaced to be taken care of, medically, educationally, housing, and so many other, basic human rights that many of these refugees should be entitled to.
Let's bring it home, shall we? In the case of Nigerians who are caught up in Ukraine as professionals or as students and so on, theirs may be slightly different. Correct me if I'm wrong, because particularly for those of them who are trying to return to Nigeria and not stay back in any of the neighboring countries or in any of the countries in Europe or the United States or even the UK, if they want to come home and the home authorities are not able to help them, how can they meander through this legally without getting caught up in the immigration rules of any of the countries that they have to pass through?
Again, I stress what I actually stated earlier. As human, every single human being, right, is entitled to the protection of the international community. If indeed the countries where many of these nationals come from, the Nigerians, the South Africans, the Asians and others, if their countries are not truly and really doing anything, to help their nationals, their citizens, these citizens should look up to the international community because, honestly, they've been dislodged and displaced through no fault of theirs. They are human beings with human rights, after all. Indeed, if the governments of many of these citizens are not doing anything, they should at least approach many of these agencies who are still trying to actually help out many refugees as possible. These students, these professionals became refugees through no fault of theirs. So the international community should still be able to at least take care of these citizens, provide them with the basic necessities. of life until indeed they'll be able to at least go back home, or until indeed the respective governments do one or two things actually to get them out of either Poland or Hungary, if they've crossed over to Hungary, or even within Ukraine. There's still so many of them there been stranded. So the international community should be able to actually take care of anybody who is a refugee under the UN Convention pertaining to refugees.
One of the things that may appear to be possible with this kind of situation that we have now is the potential, shall we say, for human trafficking, what is described as human trafficking, or traffickers to take advantage of both those who are fleeing and to use the opportunity or the cover of the fact that so many people are on the move, and many of them may not be either in the right state of mind or have the complete documents or know who to go to, and therefore they'll be vulnerable. Given this kind of circumstances, again, I know you've talked about the fact that everybody is an international citizen under this situation, but you've also said that quite a number of people have not been sticking to that. So if we have this kind of situation again, and the potential for what has just been described, already we're of course hearing reports about people being sent back, and people being sent across, and people being detained, and so on. So again, it creates a fluid situation, and I'm wondering, what do you make of this?
Well, when it comes to a war-torn situation, when it comes to a place where we have a very serious issue of, millions of refugees moving from one part of, from Ukraine to so many other countries, particularly in their millions. As I stated earlier, 10 million people have already been dislodged just in a month. We do not know how long this war is going to continue. But if it should continue at this frequency, we have a situation where there could be possibly even about 6, 7, 10 million refugees living in neighboring countries who have left Ukraine. In such circumstances, we may not be able to help people who would want to now take advantage of all these refugees and start, trafficking human beings. People would always want to take advantage of that kind of situation. All the states involved could do is to at least do their best to prevent that kind of situation happening at all. But unfortunately and sadly, there would definitely be human traffickers who would want to now take advantage of the refugee situation, arising in Ukraine as we speak. It's a very, very sad situation, but unfortunately, there will always be people who want to now milk the system and do what they could to take advantage of the serious Russian Ukraine refugee situation happening at this point in time.
Well, before I let you go, you made mention of it, so I would ask you to just give a bit of detail, because again, we have been hearing the reports. What you mentioned earlier about the Home Open scheme in the UK where you are, which is supposed to help some categories of refugees from the Ukraine. If I'm correct, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, does that apply only to Ukrainians, or is it open to anybody who is fleeing from Ukraine? How does it work?
It's unfortunately, going by what the rules are stating, the UK government is very, very clear on the position that as far as the home scheme for Ukrainians is concerned, it would only pertain to Ukrainians. They've not mentioned any other nationality fleeing persecution. And indeed, when you now want to apply for this very particular visa, they normally apply for this visa online. Particularly the sponsor who now wants to actually bring this person into the UK. And the specific question they'll be asking you is, are you Ukrainian? Not, are you an international person fleeing from crisis in Ukraine? That very particular scheme is related to Ukrainians alone and nobody else.
Well, thank you so very much, Mr. Fadino, for the clarification there. I'm sure quite a lot of people listening have learned quite a lot from this conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you on Russian Invasion this morning. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll have more stories on day 26 of the Russian invasion. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. As the Western world moves to diplomatically isolate Russia amidst widespread global condemnation over its invasion of Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, stands out as one of a few countries keen to maintain a neutral, if not supportive stance towards Moscow. Earlier in the month, it was among an overwhelming majority of states that backed a resolution at an emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly reprimanding Russia over its invasion of Ukraine and demanding Moscow immediately withdraw its forces. But that stood in stark contrast with its decision later during a UN Security Council meeting to abstain from a vote on a similar text. Following that vote, the UAE Presidential Advisor Anwar Gargash said the Gulf state, quote, believes that taking sides would only lead to more violence and that the UAE's priority was to encourage all parties to resort to diplomatic action. Well, let's talk to our correspondent in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Mayowa Adegoke joins me this morning. Mayowa, always a pleasure to see you. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, afternoon now.
Okay, afternoon for you. So let me take it from there. What's been the general reaction, as you can feel the pulse to what's going on in Europe, particularly, of course, this Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I mean, just as the government is calling for peace on every side, pretty much that's a reflection of what the people want as well. Recall that the UAE is home to over 200 nationalities, and you've got Ukrainians and Russians who also call UAE home. And what we enjoy here is that harmony despite the diversity in population. So a lot of people really want the same. So let there be peace. And if there are any differing opinions as to what the government has decided, they haven't been made public.
Now, the presidential advisor we're quoting, Mr. Gargash, had said that taking sides would only lead to more violence and that UAE's priority was to encourage all parties to resort to diplomatic action. Have the authorities in the UAE participated or tried to initiate any of such efforts on providing a way out of this crisis since the UAE has been known to play such roles in the past? It did so in the case of the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's done so in Iraq and so on. So they have some experience in this matter.
Well, the UAE government has been discussing with all parties, from the British to the Ukrainian foreign minister to even President Putin himself. The UAE is engaging in conversations across board, and they maintain that what they want is for a resolution, a peaceful resolution to all this. They're also emphasizing that they're ready to cooperate in helping where it's needed. For instance, they're actively engaging with humanitarian efforts towards those fleeing from Ukraine. For instance, there have been 2 planes, humanitarian aid sent to people fleeing from Ukraine. The first one, which was sent to Poland, is expected to benefit about 50,000 people, and the second plane is expected to benefit about 35,000 people. These are just some of the efforts that the UAE government has already made to play its part, really, in helping those who are directly affected in this crisis.
We have seen consequences, shall we say, or repercussions of what's going on in Ukraine in higher oil prices and in higher prices of commodities elsewhere. Even here in Nigeria, there have been repercussions in terms of the prices of basic staples and even other items. But in the case of the UAE, of course, being a major oil exporter, one would assume as a layman that this would be a boom time for the United Arab Emirates from all of this, especially since a great deal of Russia's output is off the market. Is that the situation? Have you seen, have there been consequences in terms of higher prices of goods in the markets?
Well, oil prices surged up to 11%, earlier this month, and that's also linked to that crisis. And you do know that Prime Minister Boris was here just a few days ago, and he was on a mission, as we hear, to bring a plea from the West. Pretty much the request is pump more oil. We're yet to find out what the result of that conversation is, if the UAE will, agree to that plea, and pretty much playing a part in the West cutting off Russia. And you do know, as you said earlier, that the UAE chooses to be neutral in all of this. So if, for instance, they say, okay, we agree with the West and pump more oil, wouldn't that be seen as an action against Russia? So that's one huge question. So we wait to see what the UAE government decides on that. However, they do continue on the humanitarian side.
Finally, before I let you go, I must ask that, when we have this kind of situation, you have a lot of conversation and a lot of people, pundits taking positions left, right, and center, academic and all of that. The UAE being an international melting point, have you seen any of that?
Not in public. Everyone seems to be agreeing with the government, as which is not a surprise. And as I said earlier, if there's anyone who doesn't agree with the government, they haven't made their opinions public. All
right, then, Maiwa Adekoke, thank you so much for the update from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and do stay safe.
Thanks for having me.
Foreign affairs analysts have continued to take a look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the strategic reasons that may have led to it. One of such is veteran diplomat and former permanent representative of Nigeria at the United Nations offices in Geneva, Switzerland, and an experienced hand on Ukrainian affairs, Ambassador Joseph Ayalogo. He told me earlier on our current affairs program Newsnight that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO's move eastwards, was considered inimical to Russia's strategic interest. Ambassador Ayalogo says even though other Eastern European countries had joined both NATO and the European Union, Ukraine's case is different.
It could be helpful, especially if you consider that your citizens are in harm's way. You do not want to say or do things that will put them more in harm's way. So we would apply diplomacy. It makes sense. Let me say that the aggression must have taken a lot of people by surprise.
All right, we'll come back to that story in a bit. We seem to have a bit of a mix-up there. But let's talk some business, shall we? And there are several talking points relating to business. As I was talking with Mayweather, one of them is oil prices, which have jumped $3 today, just today, with Brent above $110 a barrel, as European Union and other nations consider joining the United States in a Russian oil embargo, while a weakened attack on Saudi oil facilities had caused jitters. Brent crude futures climbed $3.44, or 3.2%, to $111.37 a barrel, and added a 1.2 rise on Friday as well. Prices have moved higher ahead of talks this week between European Union governments and U.S. President Joe Biden for a series of summits that aim to harden the West's response to Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. All right, joining me to discuss this is Laddie Williams, our business correspondent. Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
The oil prices thing has been from day one.
Exactly.
When it seems as if the peace talks are making headway, the prices come down.
Exactly.
When it seems as if there's... So today, I mean, the jump is dramatic, isn't it?
It's quite dramatic because it actually started on Friday. You know, we saw earlier in the week, we saw oil actually fell, below the $100 mark. You know, we've had a pretty volatile week, but from Friday, we saw that oil started going up again, back above $100, because obviously we see the fears again on the Russia-Ukraine crisis creeping up, and obviously that means disruptions, with production of oil. So the sentiment traders actually take advantage of that, and we start to see oil prices jump again, as we saw on Friday and today. And obviously Aramco, they've been in the news. Saudi Arabia's state-owned Aramco, they've been in the news all weekend. They made stellar profits in 2021. They're the ones taking advantage of this oil rally, and which started in 2021. We saw oil get to about $90 per barrel. So they are making a huge buck there, because their profits went up by 120% in 2021. And now they're talking about ramping up production to actually meet up with disruptions from Russia. So we see they're ready to take more profit even in 2022 as it looks.
That's the issue of the oil prices, but sanctions are also being muled now on Russian assets in the UK. Tell me more about that, because we had heard before that they were going to put them on the freeze. So what's this one?
Yeah, so right now we see the Russian what's it called? Their foreign reserves is frozen. Out there, but and obviously they had bond payments to make earlier in the week, which they actually did make, because the U.S. actually allowed them, to make those payments. But
because
obviously
the beneficiaries were mostly Western creditors.
You can't sanction the bond holders, at this point. So, but now there's still fears, about future bond payments. They have one still coming up March 21st, I think. That's a huge payment, almost about $2 billion more in coupon payments that they have to make to bondholders. So obviously, there's still jitters, because obviously you can't have sovereign bonds are supposed to be safe. So having a default, by a country like Russia would rattle, that market, and obviously investors in that bond will take a blow from that. So as it looks now, Russia is getting all their assets frozen, but those assets now, there's the Europe and allies are looking at, how about we use some of these funds to help Ukraine? Some of these seized assets, we use it, to help with repairs, after the war, help Ukraine get back on its feet. Which is quite but they're still mulling it. It's not confirmed yet. There's still, there's going to be talks, to see how they can actually do that. But obviously, it seems like that might.
It's going to be a big disruption.
It's going to be a big one. It's going to be a massive one, because I don't know if Russia will find that funny. But
when Ini and I were talking last week on the business developers, I believe it would be Thursday or Friday. We sounded like metallurgical engineers when we started mentioning the amount of metals that Russia and Ukraine both produce and consume.
Exactly.
Now you've got Australia, which is the biggest exporter of aluminium.
Yes.
Most people don't know what that is or what it does. But now they're banning shipments to Russia.
Exactly.
Again, how does this play into this whole mix?
Because Russia imports, most of their alumina from that country, and this disruption will actually affect industries that, produce aluminium in Russia. At this point. So that would obviously stop their production and, cause them to not be able to export some of these the
finished products. And the prices will also go up even locally.
Prices will go up, because that's another disruption again for Russian export, which is aluminium. So obviously, with this stopping their alumina supplies to Russia is going to impact the industries in Russia and disrupt, flow of aluminum from Russia at this point.
Many countries have had prices spike, particularly of products which have inputs from Russia, or which are made by Russia, or Ukraine for that matter. And one of the stories this morning is that Spain has thousands protesting higher prices.
Oh, yes.
And Spain, before this war, was already battling. Its government was battling high inflation, high unemployment, and all of that. So again, this is another disruption at that level.
Exactly, because obviously globally now, it's all about rising prices right now. Inflation is the massive elephant in the room, and we see all central bankers globally trying hard to fight inflation. But you know, you now have to make a choice. It's either you're fighting bringing down inflation, but at the expense of a recession.
Right.
You know, that's the issue most of these central bankers have to actually deal with at this point. But the Spanish people are saying, oh, fine, we get it. Russia-Ukraine crisis is, you know, causing problems. But we had these problems, you know, before the war. And now you're raising rates again because they had some of their electricity actually go up.
Yeah, the prices.
The prices.
Just like we have here.
Just like we have here. And they're not finding it funny. And we see the Spaniards there going into the streets and actually protesting and telling the government, you know what, be a responsible government. Bring down our taxes at this point. Make it easier for us, basically. That's what they're saying.
You mentioned central bankers. Nigeria's central bankers are meeting today.
Yeah, that's today.
The Monetary Policy Committee is meeting today, and one of, if not the main subject of discussion, is going to be this war.
Oh, yes.
And the impact on our own economy.
Yeah.
What are the feelings that you guys are getting?
Because right now we're seeing, obviously, rising prices in Nigeria, rising energy prices, which is taking every other thing up. We're seeing bakers actually complain and saying that, okay, you know what, if this continues, we're actually going to shut down. So the MPC have a decision to make at this point. Obviously, they don't want it to disrupt the growth, the fragile growth, Nigeria is having, right now. But at the same time, inflation is going up. So analysts believe the MPC is going to, retain, rates, at this meeting because they obviously want this fragile growth that we're seeing to actually continue, because raising the cost of borrowing right now is going to compound all of this stress that, everyone is facing with rising cost of living, at this point. So our punters are looking at, the MPC would actually retain, at this point.
The rates where they have been
all along.
That could prove to be tough, of course, because for the first time, I remember a business reported that the rates were kept steady the last time, and in spite of that, inflation inched up shortly afterwards.
Exactly.
So again,
even higher. So at the end of the day, even you hear discussions about, can the central bankers actually really fight inflation, at this point? Because you keep the rate steady, inflation is still trending up. We've seen the Fed in the U.S. actually raise, rates at this point by 0.25 basis points. But obviously, analysts believe that is not enough, to bring down inflation in the U.S. But at the end of the day, you have to make it, because Nigeria's situation is quite different, if I say so, because we have salaries, incomes are being strained at this point. So there's really not much demand, but we're still seeing rising prices. So that's why you see the word stagflation, right, being thrown around at this point. So it's a tough place to be for a central banker.
Yeah,
right
it is a tough place
because
to
you
be.
have to choose. There's a serious trade-off here. It's either you're ready to bring down inflation and have a recession, or you just
you let things taper on and hope that at some point, because obviously this Russia-Ukraine war is, raising cost of living higher, with all of this disruption, because these two are powerhouses when it comes to agricultural exports. So, yeah, it just we need peace in Europe to actually. Yes, and who would have thought that Nigerians and people like us would have so much stake in having peace in other places. Right. I guess it just brings to mind the statement that the world is a global village.
It's a global village.
Laddie Williams, thank you so much. Of course, there will be more of that right after this on Business Morning, and then later on in the afternoon on Business Incorporated. We'll unpack all of that in more detail. But in the meantime, we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll be on the last leg of the program this morning. Please stay with us. All right, thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. We can now take you back to the veteran diplomat, Ambassador Joseph Ayalogo, who had been taking a look at the strategic reasons that may have led to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. He told me earlier on our Current Affairs program, Newsnight, that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and NATO move eastwards was considered inimical to Russia's strategic interest. The ambassador said even though other Eastern European countries had joined both NATO and the European Union, Ukraine's case is different.
On Russia a bit, it has been complaining about what it calls NATO move eastwards. It has been complaining, but not necessarily taking any drastic action. That was why you saw Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, most of Hungary, most of which were under the Russian influence under the Soviet USSR regime period. But one might say that it has the annoyance, let's put it like that, has come to a head in Ukraine, and they thought and couldn't thought that that is it, that this was the time to act. With regard to why should they even do that with Ukraine? Well, there has been a lot of, there is a closer affinity between Ukraine and Russia in terms of, the same Slavic, Eastern Slavic ethnic grouping, the same, they were all part of the Kievan Rus. They were also part of the Russia under the Tsarist regimes and so on. That's what Putin sees Russia really. Putin sees Ukraine as a Russian sphere of influence. Now, when you are now talking of the concept of power blocks, spheres of interest, which define the international relations in the past centuries up to even the middle of the 20th century, it was those concepts of spheres of interest that led to the First World War and the Second World War. So, for those reasons, Putin, rightly or wrongly, feels it still has a hold. It must have a hold. Russia must have a hold on Ukraine. And a few other former members of the USSR, but I think they are a lot more sensitive about Ukraine. And now that concept, that attitude is running against what you have in Ukraine now as still a nationalist feeling that they need to be free, that they want to define what they do, who they relate with. They don't see that they are in any way antipathetic to Russia, that they would do anything ever to undermine Russia's interest. I think that was part of the gesture they made when 1994 they handed over all the nuclear arsenal that remained in Ukraine. At least give a sense of assurance, but somehow Putin argues that he's not reassured, that part of what they call Russian security system includes must include Ukraine, that is, well, let me say, subservient, but under the control of Russia. So that is the situation.
For more on this interview, do watch Newsnight tonight. It airs at 9 p.m. right here on Channels Television. 3 U.S. volunteer fighters who have risked their lives alongside Ukrainian soldiers say they had joined the struggle against Russian forces to stop civilian suffering and in the name of freedom. The group, including a female college student from New York who works at JFK Airport, spoke of their narrow escape after they said the vehicle they were traveling in hit a landmine yesterday on the front line near the capital, Kyiv. Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February to demilitarize Ukraine and capture nationalists. While Ukraine's armed forces are heavily outnumbered, they have mounted significant resistance. Ukraine has also established an international legion for people from abroad, and President Zielinski has publicly urged foreigners to come and fight side by side with Ukrainians against the Russians, whom he described as war criminals. Mr. Zielinski said that more than 16,000 foreigners have volunteered without specifying how many had arrived.
Our vehicle hit a mine and blew up. So that's how I ended up here, unfortunately. But luckily, my friends are okay. One of the gentlemen in the car was really severely injured, but they're taking care of him upstairs, and he's going to make it. So, yeah, we were going to do a mission today. We were trying to go to, our location, and then, unfortunately, sorry, my head is a little foggy right now. But yeah, and we unfortunately were going through the fields and then hit a mine. I felt a calling to come here. I felt like it was the right thing to do. I feel like what's happening here, what Putin is doing, is evil, and there's no reason to be putting all these people, millions and millions of people, through the suffering and torment that they're going through, and I felt like I needed to be here and try to help in any way that I can. Yeah, I wasn't formally trained. I have some hospital experience, some medical experience, but I've never worked in combat before. It's my first time, so.
Our driver drug him out of the vehicle, actually. He saved his life because the vehicle started burning. There was another landmine behind, right next to the back right tire, and when I stepped out of the vehicle is when I noticed it, because I stepped here and I saw a landmine between my legs, so we got the hell away from the vehicle, because that's what you got to do. I can't even count a second between the time that he said there are landmines everywhere and the boom. There was no time in between the fact that he said landmines are everywhere and then it went off.
Our next report is on the personal story of a 1941 Leningrad siege survivor who is stuck in yet another war. A lifetime ago and almost 870 miles away, Margarita Morozova lived through the World War II siege of Leningrad. Now the 87-year-old Ukrainian finds herself once more in a city under attack.
A long time ago and 1,400 kilometers away, Margarita Morozova lived through the World War II siege of Leningrad. Now the 87-year-old Ukrainian finds herself once more in a city under attack. The retired librarian lives in Kharkiv, a Ukrainian city of 1.5 million people that lies 25 kilometers from the Russian border that has been barraged by Russian air and rocket strikes that have reduced many buildings to rubble.
I could never imagine that a new war would start in my old age. In my worst nightmare, I cannot even imagine that such massacre will be repeated. It is horrible. We've been living in Ukraine for almost 60 years. When we came here, it was so good here.
Morozova was just 7 years old in 1941 when German forces began the siege of the Soviet city of Leningrad in Russia, now known as St. Petersburg, where about 1.5 million people died during the 2 years of blockade. She says she still has vivid memories of the Nazi bombardment after she and her mother missed the ferry out of the port, only to watch with horror as the boat was then destroyed by shells. After the war, she moved to Kharkiv in Ukraine, where she has lived for the last 60 years, and where she now finds unmistakable echoes of her past.
In my childhood, I hid from bombardments in the corridor. We took shelter in old buildings, and it is the same now. Once shelling of Kharkiv begins, when air raid siren is on, we go to the corridor. We don't know if it will protect us or not. It is very terrifying when young people die, when beautiful buildings collapse.
Earlier this week, the mayor of Kharkiv said the city had been under constant attack by Russian forces. Russia refers to the invasion as a special military operation and says its forces do not target civilians.
We saw war and we know what it is like. I want the war to be over. I want them to leave Ukraine in peace. Ukraine is an independent country, so what are they doing here?
Caught in a conflict between the land of her birth and the land where she lives now, Morozova believes it will be a disaster for both sides.
It is a disaster for the Russian people too. Their children are dying for nothing. I'm asking, what for? During the Great Patriotic War, fine, it was clear we fought fascists, different people. While here, they're friendly people. We have common and close cultures. The languages are close. How is it possible that this has happened? It's very dreadful.
Kharkiv, an engineering and a transport hub, is no stranger to war. During World War II, it was fought over by German and Russian forces and changed hands several times.
And just before we go, one sports story. Ukrainian high jumper Yaroslava Manuchik, who was forced to flee her home in Dnipro after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, says she was fighting for her country in a stadium after winning gold in the high jump at the World Indoor Championships in Belgrade. Quote, "I didn't think I was doing it for myself or my medal. I was doing it for all the Ukrainian nation. I want to show Ukrainian people are strong people. They never give up. Our military protect our country at home, and today I protect my country on the track." The 20-year-old, who is the reigning European indoor high jump champion and won bronze at the Tokyo Olympics, spent days sheltering in a cellar before traveling for 3 days by car to reach Serbia, a trip of nearly 2,000 kilometers. Manuchik had won gold with a lip of 2.02 meters. Yet again, another cause for hope. And it's on that note that we end this morning's program. There'll be an update at 5 o'clock. Do join Avarachi Bani and Millicent Walker for that. To have yourselves a pleasant day ahead. I'm Ladi Akiri Dulwali.